"You're dead when we get home." The words were hissed through clenched teeth, carrying over the clinking crystal and soft jazz of the dim restaurant. Claribel froze, her fork trembling halfway to her mouth, the heavy weight of her boyfriend's threat settling like a stone in her stomach. She stared at her lap, trying to shrink into her plus-size frame, praying nobody heard. But someone did. At the adjacent table, a man in a bespoke charcoal suit slowly set down his espresso. Sincere Vaughan didn't tolerate disrespect in his city, and he certainly didn't tolerate cowards. Soft candlelight flickered against the polished mahogany tables of Valenti's, Chicago's most exclusive Italian dining room. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, rich truffles, and expensive burgundy. For most patrons, the ambiance was a backdrop for romance or high-stakes business. For 26-year-old Claribel, it was a beautifully decorated hell. She shifted uncomfortably in her emerald green wrap dress. She had spent 2 weeks' salary on it, hoping the deep color and heavy silk would complement her soft, full figure. She was a big girl, thick thighs, broad hips, and a generous bust, and she had spent her entire life navigating a world that demanded women be small. Derek, her boyfriend of 3 years, was usually the loudest voice making those demands. Tonight was supposed to be their anniversary dinner, a rare treat that Claribel had secretly hoped would be a turning point. Instead, it was just another stage for his cruelty. "Are you really going to eat all of that?" Derek asked, his voice a low, mocking drawl. He gestured with his wineglass toward the plate of wild mushroom risotto resting in front of her. He was conventionally handsome, with styled blonde hair and a sharp jawline, but his eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. Claribel's cheeks burned. The restaurant was crowded, and she felt the phantom sting of 100 eyes on her, even though no one was actually looking. It's my main course, Derek. I haven't eaten since breakfast." "And it shows," he muttered, taking a sip of his Cabernet. "I told you to order the sea bass. It's light. But no, you have to embarrass me by gorging yourself on carbs in front of half my firm's partners. Look at you. You're spilling out of that dress." Tears pricked the corners of Claribel's eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She was used to this, the insidious chipping away of her self-esteem, the quiet remarks in public, the explosive rages in the private. She stared down at the risotto, her appetite completely gone. She wanted to disappear, to fold into herself, until she vanished. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the restaurant. "You will be," Derek snapped. He leaned closer, his features twisting into an ugly sneer. His hand darted under the heavy linen tablecloth, his fingers clamping down on her thick thigh with a vicious, bruising grip. Claribel gasped, her eyes widening in shock and pain. "Derek, please, you're hurting me," she breathed, terrified of making a scene. It was then that he leaned in, his mouth inches from her ear, his breath hot and smelling of sour wine. "You're dead when we get home. I'm going to teach you how to behave, you fat, useless cow." The words hung in the air between them, a promise of violence that made Claribel's blood run cold. She knew what happened when they got home. She knew the closed doors, the shoved shoulders, the terrifying isolation of their shared apartment. Her fork trembled in her hand, clattering noisily against the edge of her porcelain plate. At the table directly to their right, separated only by a low divider of imported ferns, the atmosphere shifted. Sincere Vaughan had been enjoying a rare moment of peace. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Vaughan Syndicate, a man who controlled the city's underground with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He was striking, tall, broad-shouldered, with raven-black hair and eyes the color of a stormy ocean. A faint, silver scar cut through his left eyebrow, a testament to a life built on brutality. He was dining alone, flanked only by his two most trusted enforcers, Enzo and Matteo, who sat at a discreet table near the exit. Sincere had been ignoring the couple next to him until he heard the distinct, sharp sound of a man threatening a woman. His acute hearing, honed by years of surviving assassination attempts and betrayals, picked up the hissed words over the jazz music. "You're dead when we get home." Sincere slowly lowered his espresso cup. The delicate china clinked softly against the saucer. He turned his head, his dark gaze locking onto the adjacent table. He saw the way the blonde man was gripping the woman under the table, the subtle, violent tension in his arm. And then he looked at her. She was weeping silently, her dark hair falling in soft waves around a face that Sincere instantly found captivating. She wasn't skin and bones like the socialites who usually threw themselves at him. She was lush, curved, and inherently beautiful, but her eyes held the terror of a trapped animal. Sincere felt a sudden, foreign flare of absolute rage ignite in his chest. He was a ruthless man, a criminal, a killer, but he had a strict, unbreakable code. Women and children were untouchable, and cowards who used fear to control them were his favorite kind of prey. Without a word, Sincere stood up. He was an imposing figure, radiating an aura of dark, unyielding power. The bespoke charcoal suit clung to his muscular frame, and the heavy gold watch on his wrist caught the candlelight. As he moved, the entire restaurant seemed to subconsciously hold its breath. Waiters paused mid-step. Sincere stepped around the fern divider and stopped directly behind Derek's chair. Derek, oblivious to the shift in the room's temperature, was still glaring at Clarabelle. "Wipe your face!" he hissed. "You're making a spectacle." "I believe," a deep, gravelly voice echoed from above. "The only spectacle here is you." Derek whipped his head around, annoyed, his mouth opening to snap a retort. The words died in his throat. He craned his neck, looking up at the towering, terrifying figure of Sincere Vaughan. Derek was a corporate accountant. He dealt in spreadsheets and tax loopholes. He had no idea who Sincere was, but his primal instincts immediately recognized an apex predator. "Excuse me?" Derek stammered, releasing Clarabelle's leg and shrinking back into his chair. "This is a private conversation." Sincere didn't smile. His eyes were completely dead, void of any human warmth. "I heard your conversation," Sincere said, his voice quiet but carrying a lethal edge. "It offended me, and when I am offended, I tend to react poorly." Clarabelle sat paralyzed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the stranger, taking in his striking, terrifying features. He felt dangerous, yet for the first time all night, she didn't feel like the target of the danger. "Look, buddy," Derek tried to muster some bravado, puffing out his chest. "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to back off. She's my girlfriend." Before Derek could even blink, Sincere's hand shot out. His large, scarred fingers closed around the back of Derek's neck, gripping him with the strength of a steel vice. Sincere didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned down until his face was inches from Derek's. "If you ever speak to her like that again," Sincere whispered, ensuring only Derek and Clarabelle could hear, "if you ever lay a hand on her, or if you even breathe in her direction without permission, I will have my men peel the skin from your body while you are still awake to feel it. Do you understand me?" Derek turned an ashen shade of grey. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to nod, but Sincere's grip held his head rigid. From the corner of his eye, Sincere noticed Enzo and Matteo had quietly approached, standing just behind him, their hands casually resting inside their suit jackets. The implicit threat of firearms was clear to anyone paying attention. "Get out," Sincere commanded softly, releasing Derek and wiping his hand on a linen napkin as if he had just touched something foul. "Leave the city tonight. If you go back to the apartment, my men will be waiting." Derek didn't hesitate. He practically fell out of his chair, scrambling to his feet. He didn't look at Clarabel. He didn't grab his coat. He simply bolted toward the exit, leaving his half-empty wine glass and a terrified, abandoned girlfriend in his wake. Clarabel sat frozen, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The restaurant slowly resumed its chatter, though the waiters maintained a wide, respectful berth around the table. Sincere turned his attention to Clarabel, his cold, hardened expression instantly softening. "May I sit down?" he asked, his voice entirely different now, smooth, polite, and surprisingly gentle. Clarabel, trembling, could only manage a tiny nod. The Mafia boss pulled out Derek's vacated chair and sat across from her, his dark eyes studying her flushed, tear-stained face. The silence stretching between them was heavy, filled with the lingering adrenaline of the confrontation. Clarabel clutched her linen napkin in her lap, her knuckles white. She felt entirely out of her depth. The man sitting across from her exuded money, power, and a lethal kind of grace. He was the kind of man who belonged on the cover of a magazine, or perhaps a wanted poster. "You're shaking," Sincere observed, his gaze dropping to her trembling hands. He left," Clarabel whispered, the reality of the situation finally crashing over her. "Derek just left me here. A rat flees when it smells smoke," Sincere said calmly. He signaled a waiter with a subtle lift of his chin. The maitre d' practically materialized at the table, bowing slightly. "Mr. Vaughan, sir. Is everything to your satisfaction?" the maitre d' asked nervously. Vaughan. Clarabel recognized the name from the local news, whispered rumors in coffee shops, the kind of name you didn't say too loudly. Sincere Vaughan. She was sitting across from the head of the Chicago mob. Her breath hitched, a new kind of terror warring with the strange sense of safety he had just provided. "The young lady's meal is cold," Sincere said, not breaking eye contact with Clarabel. "Take it away. Bring her a fresh plate, the bone-in ribeye, medium rare, truffle mash, and the molten chocolate cake for dessert." "Right away, Mr. Vaughan." The waiter cleared the rejected risotto and vanished. I can't eat all that," Clarabel stammered, her old insecurities flaring up immediately. She instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, trying to hide her heavy curves. "I shouldn't." Sincere leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He reached out, his warm, rough fingertips gently brushing against her wrist, prompting her to uncross her arms. "You will eat whatever you desire, whenever you desire it," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Do not let a weak man dictate the space you take up in this world. You are beautiful. You require sustenance to maintain that beauty." Clarabel stared at him, stunned. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Nobody had ever looked at her body, her thick, soft body, and called it a prerequisite for beauty. Derek had always made her feel like a burden, a project to be whittled down. Sincere looked at her like she was a Renaissance painting. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice steadying slightly. "You don't know me." "I know men like him," Sincere replied, a dark shadow crossing his features. "And I know a woman in pain when I see one." "What is your name?" "Clarabel. Clarabel Collins." "Sincere," he offered, though she already knew. "Tell me, Clarabel Collins, did you live with him?" She nodded miserably. "Yes. His name is on the lease. He has the keys. All my things are there." Sincere frowned, a dangerous glint returning to his eyes. He raised a hand, and within seconds, Enzo, a massive man with a thick beard and a tailored suit, stepped up to the table. "Boss?" Enzo murmured. "Find out where Derek— What is his last name, Clarabelle?" "Vance. Derek Vance." "Find out where Derek Vance lives. Send a team to clear out all of Miss Collins's belongings. Everything. I want it packed and moved tonight. Change the locks on the door and leave a message for Mr. Vance that if he returns, the lease will be the least of his worries." "Understood," Enzo said, nodding at Clarabelle before disappearing toward the front door. "You can't do that!" Clarabelle gasped, half rising from her chair. "He'll go to the police. He will do nothing," Sincere interrupted smoothly. "Men like Derek only understand power. Right now I hold all of it, and by extension, so do you." The food arrived, smelling divine. The perfectly seared steak, the creamy potatoes. Clarabelle realized she was ravenous. The constant anxiety of dining with Derek had kept her starved, both physically and emotionally. Hesitantly, she took a bite. It was incredible. She closed her eyes, letting out a soft sigh of appreciation. When she opened them, Sincere was watching her intently, a primal, undeniable heat in his gaze. It made her flush all over again. But this time, it wasn't from shame. It was from desire. The sheer masculinity radiating from him was intoxicating. They sat together for an hour. Sincere didn't interrogate her, but he asked gentle, pointed questions. He learned she worked as an archivist at the city library, that she loved old books, and that she had been orphaned in her early 20s, leaving her with a modest inheritance that Derek had generously offered to manage. At the mention of her finances, Sincere's jaw tightened, but he said nothing to alarm her. "It's late," Sincere finally said, standing up and dropping a thick stack of $100 bills on the table, far more than the meal cost. "My men are securing your belongings, but your apartment is compromised. You will come with me." "Come with you?" Clarabelle hesitated. She was essentially agreeing to go home with a Mafia boss. The rational part of her brain screamed that she was jumping from the frying pan into an inferno. But looking at Sincere, seeing the steadfast protection in his posture, her intuition told a different story. "I own a secure penthouse at the top of the Grand Hotel," Sincere explained, stepping around the table to pull her chair out. He offered her his arm. "You will have your own suite. You will be perfectly safe. Tomorrow, we will sort out the rest of your life. But tonight, you need to rest without looking over your shoulder." Clarabelle looked at his offered arm. It was thick, corded with muscle beneath the wool suit. She took a deep breath, her heavy breasts rising and falling, and slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. They walked out of the restaurant together. The cool Chicago night air hit them, rain slicking the pavement. A sleek, black Maybach was idling at the curb, Matteo holding the rear door open. As Clarabelle slid into the luxurious leather interior, Sincere followed, his large frame making the spacious cabin feel suddenly intimate. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding seamlessly into the city traffic. Clarabelle looked out the tinted window at the blurring city lights. She felt entirely unmoored, as if the life she had known had been severed in a single, violent stroke. She glanced at Sincere. He was staring straight ahead, his profile sharp and unyielding in the passing streetlights. "You don't have to do this," she whispered into the quiet hum of the car. "I'm just a stranger. I'm nobody." Sincere turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "You are not a stranger anymore, Clarabelle, and in my world, there is no such thing as a coincidence. You were placed in my path for a reason." He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her soft jaw, sending a shiver of electricity straight down her spine. "You are safe now. That is all that matters." The penthouse at the top of the Grand Hotel was not a mere hotel room. It was a fortress suspended in the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline, while the interior was a masterpiece of dark woods, brushed steel, and opulent leather. It felt exactly like Sincere. Cold, expensive, and intimidatingly beautiful. Claribel stood awkwardly in the center of the massive living room, still clutching her small evening bag. Her emerald wrap dress felt incredibly out of place amidst the stark, masculine luxury. "Your suite is down the hall to the right," Sincere said, shedding his suit jacket and tossing it casually over a leather armchair. He began to unbutton his crisp white shirt, revealing glimpses of heavily tattooed, muscular skin. Claribel quickly averted her eyes, her face burning. "I've instructed the hotel staff to stock the bathroom with whatever you might need," Sincere continued, walking toward a built-in wet bar to pour himself a glass of amber liquid. "If you require anything else, just pick up the phone. My men are stationed in the hallway and at the private elevator. No one comes up here without my explicit authorization." "Thank you," Claribel murmured. She felt utterly exhausted, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. I think I'll just go to sleep." "Rest, Claribel," Sincere said softly, raising his glass to her. "Tomorrow brings a new day." Claribel retreated to the guest suite. It was larger than her entire apartment. A massive king-sized bed dominated the room, covered in high-thread count Egyptian cotton. In the sprawling marble bathroom, she found a plush white bathrobe. She stripped off the green dress, letting it pool at her feet, and caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror. She paused, staring at her reflection. She saw the rolls of her stomach, the heavy slope of her breasts, the thick curve of her thighs. For years, Derek had conditioned her to view this body with disgust, a project that constantly needed fixing. But tonight, Sincere Vaughan had looked at this exact body and called it a masterpiece. He had defended her. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. She wrapped the robe around herself, tying the belt tightly to conceal her shape, and crawled into the massive bed. Despite the strange surroundings and the surreal events of the evening, sheer mental exhaustion pulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke hours later. The room was bathed in the pale grey light of early morning. Claribel sat up, momentarily disoriented. The events of the previous night rushed back, and she threw off the covers. She needed water. Padding softly barefoot out of the guest suite, she navigated the quiet penthouse. As she neared the living area, she heard low, urgent voices. "Found the paperwork in his home office desk, boss." It was Enzo's voice, rough and professional. Claribel froze in the hallway, pressing herself against the cool wall, out of sight. "Show me," Sincere replied, his tone devoid of the warmth he had shown her the night before. This was the voice of the Don. "The kid, Derek Vance, he's in deep," Enzo continued, the rustle of papers echoing in the large room. "He's been gambling. Underground rings mostly, but he got careless. He owes $250,000 to the Russo syndicate." Claribel's heart stopped. The Russos. Even she knew who they were. The most violent, unpredictable crime family in the tri-state area, and Sincere Vaughan's sworn, blood-feud rivals. "A civilian owing the Russos money is none of my concern," Sincere said coldly. "Why are you bringing this to me, Enzo?" "Because of how he planned to pay it off," Enzo replied. There was a heavy, terrible pause. "We went through the financial records he was managing for Miss Collins, her inheritance. He's already drained half of it to pay off the interest, but the principal isn't enough to cover the debt. Get to the point." 3 weeks ago, Enzo said, his voice dropping an octave, Vance took out a life insurance policy on Clarabelle Collins. The payout is precisely $500,000. He forged her signature, and he named himself as the sole beneficiary. In the hallway, Clarabelle clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the wall, the plush carpet muffling her descent. "You're dead when we get home." The threat at the restaurant hadn't been an exaggeration. It hadn't been just another night of verbal abuse. Derek had been planning to kill her. He was going to murder her to pay off his debts to the mob. "Son of a bitch," Sincere whispered, the venom in his voice palpable. He was going to stage an accident. The Russo's collectors gave him a deadline of tomorrow, Enzo confirmed. He was running out of time. If you hadn't intervened at the restaurant, boss, she wouldn't have survived the night. The sound of shattering glass made Clarabelle jump. Sincere had hurled his crystal tumbler against the wall. "Where is he?" Sincere roared, a terrifying explosion of violence that shook the penthouse. "My men tracked him. He panicked and ran to a safe house in Little Italy. Russo territory. He's begging them for protection, telling them he has the money coming." "He has nothing," Sincere snarled. "He is a dead man walking. Boss, if we go into Russo territory to grab this kid, it's an act of war. You know the treaty we signed last year. We cross that line, the streets will run red." "Over a civilian?" Clarabelle sat paralyzed on the floor, tears streaming down her face. She was the civilian. She was the spark that was about to ignite a mob war. She couldn't let Sincere destroy his empire, risk his life and his men for a fat, gullible librarian who had been stupid enough to trust a monster. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She stepped out from the hallway, her white robe clutched tightly around her. Both men turned instantly. Enzo immediately lowered his gaze out of respect, while Sincere's eyes locked onto hers. He saw her pale face, her tear-streaked cheeks, and he knew instantly she had heard everything. "Clarabelle," Sincere said, his voice dropping the lethal edge and returning to a soft, urgent timbre. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from her. "You can't do this," she sobbed, looking up into his stormy eyes. "You can't go to war for me. I'll just leave. I'll run away. I won't let you risk everything." Sincere's hands came up, gripping her shoulders with a firm, grounding strength. He didn't let her finish. "Do you think I fear the Russos?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum of absolute dominance. "Do you think I built this city by walking away from what belongs to me?" Clarabelle blinked through her tears, confused. What belongs to you?" Sincere reached down, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His touch was a burning brand against her skin. "Derek Vance made a fatal miscalculation," Sincere murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips before rising to meet her terrified gaze. "He brought a treasure into the light, and he showed it to a dragon." He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, the heat of his massive body radiating against her. "You are not a civilian anymore, Clarabelle. You are under my protection, and anyone who plots to harm what is mine," he paused, his eyes turning black with deadly intent, "will be wiped from the face of the earth." Morning sunlight pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, golden shadows across the imported Turkish rugs. Clarabelle stood exactly where Sincere had left her, the heavy revelation of Derek's murderous plot still ringing in her ears. Sincere had departed shortly after his declaration, taking Enzo with him to a secure location in the West Loop to strategize. He had left her under the watchful eye of Matteo and 4 other heavily armed guards stationed outside the suite. For the first time in her life, Clarabelle felt a bizarre mixture of absolute terror and profound safety. Derek, The man she had shared a bed with, the man who had meticulously chipped away at her sanity for 3 years, had wanted her dead for a life insurance payout. He had viewed her life as nothing more than a stepping stone to clear his gambling debts. The betrayal was a physical ache in her chest, sharp and suffocating. Yet juxtaposed against that horror was Sincere Vaughan, a crime boss who had casually offered to go to war over her. Around noon, the private elevator chimed. Claribel tensed, clutching the plush fabric of her robe, but Matteo's calm voice through the intercom reassured her. "Miss Collins, Mr. Vaughan sent a specialist for you. Are you decent?" Claribel blinked, confused. A specialist? The heavy oak doors opened, and a petite, impeccably dressed woman breezed into the penthouse, followed by 3 bellhops pushing rolling racks of clothing. The woman had sharp cheekbones and an air of intense efficiency. "Good afternoon, darling," the woman said, her French accent thick and melodic. "I am Genevieve. Sincere called me from his office on Michigan Avenue. He said you arrived with nothing but a dinner dress and a broken heart, and he demanded I bring half of the Gold Coast boutiques to your living room." Claribel stared at the racks of clothing. There were silks, cashmeres, tailored wool coats, and fine linens, all in rich jewel tones and soft neutrals. I can't afford any of this," Claribel stammered, her face flushing. "I don't have my wallet, and even if I did—" "Sincere handles the accounts, my dear." Genevieve waved a manicured hand dismissively. She stepped closer, her keen eyes sweeping over Claribel's robust, curvy frame. Unlike the salespeople in high-end department stores, who usually looked at Claribel with thinly veiled disdain, Genevieve's eyes lit up with genuine artistic appreciation. "Oh, you are glorious. A true classic silhouette. That boy you were with must have been blind, yes?" For the next 3 hours, the penthouse transformed into a private fitting room. Genevieve didn't try to hide Claribel's body behind baggy, shapeless tents. Instead, she selected garments that cinched at Claribel's waist, flared beautifully over her wide hips, and tastefully accentuated her heavy breasts. There was a pair of tailored, high-waisted, wide-leg trousers that made her legs look miles long, paired with a soft, ivory silk blouse. There was a stunning wrap-style cashmere sweater in deep plum that felt like a warm embrace. "You see?" Genevieve said, turning Claribel toward the massive gilded mirror in the hallway. "You are not meant to be small, Claribel. You are meant to take up space beautifully." Tears pricked Claribel's eyes again, but this time they were born of a strange, fragile hope. She looked at her reflection. She looked expensive. She looked powerful. She looked like a woman who belonged in a penthouse overlooking Lakeshore Drive, not a woman cowering in a cramped apartment. When Sincere returned, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air crackled with his magnetic, dangerous energy. He shrugged off his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his black dress shirt, revealing the intricate ink that crawled up his forearms. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her. Claribel was wearing a simple, elegant, navy blue wrap dress Genevieve had insisted she keep on. The fabric clung to her curves in all the right places, the deep V-neck highlighting her décolletage. She nervously smoothed her hands over her stomach, a leftover habit from years of Derek's cruel commentary. Sincere crossed the room slowly, his eyes dark and dilated. The intensity of his stare pinned her to the floor. He didn't speak until he was standing mere inches from her, the scent of bergamot and danger wrapping around her senses. "Stop that," he murmured, his large hand reaching out to gently pull her hands away from her stomach. He laced his fingers through hers. "Never hide yourself from me. You are absolute perfection." "Sincere," she breathed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You shouldn't have bought all this. It's too much." "Nothing is too much," he replied, his voice a gravelly whisper. He lifted his free hand, his knuckles brushing against her flushed cheek. "I told you, you are mine to protect now. And I take care of what is mine." Before Clarabelle could process the possessive weight of his words, the heavy oak door of the penthouse swung open. Enzo strode in, his expression grim. He didn't apologize for the interruption. In their world, bad news waited for no romance. "Boss," Enzo said, his voice tight, "we have a massive problem, and it's not just the kid." Sincere didn't step away from Clarabelle, but his posture instantly rigidified into that of a general preparing for battle. "Speak." "Dominic Russo just reached out," Enzo stated, handing Sincere an encrypted burner phone. "He has Derek, but he doesn't care about the $250,000 debt anymore. Dominic knows you took the girl. He knows you intervened." "And?" Sincere prompted, his jaw ticking. "Dominic isn't demanding the money." Enzo swallowed hard. "He's demanding a trade. He says Derek offered him something far more valuable than cash to clear his debt. Derek offered him the logistical shipping routes through Navy Pier." "Our routes, boss." Sincere's eyes narrowed into dangerous, lethal slits. "Derek is a civilian accountant. He has no access to my shipping routes." "That's the twist," Enzo said, glancing nervously at Clarabelle before looking back at his boss. "Derek told Dominic he's been sleeping with the enemy. He claims he has an inside source in our syndicate, someone high up, someone who gave Derek the operational codes to hand over to the Russos." The room plunged into an icy silence. A mole, the most dangerous, devastating threat to any organized crime family, wasn't a rival gang. It was rot from the inside. "Who?" Sincere demanded softly, the quietness of his voice far more terrifying than a shout. "Dominic wouldn't say, but he wants a sit-down, tomorrow night, midnight, at the abandoned rail yards near the south side. He said if you don't show up to negotiate the transfer of the pier routes, he will send Derek's inside man to finish the job on Miss Collins." Clarabelle gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The nightmare wasn't over. Derek's cowardly, desperate gambling had tangled her up in a web of Mafia treason. Sincere turned to Clarabelle, his eyes burning with a terrifying, protective fury. "They will not touch you," he vowed, his voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "I will burn Chicago to the ground before I let a single Russo set eyes on you." He turned back to Enzo. "Prepare the men. We are going to a meeting." The following night, the air at the abandoned South Side rail yards was thick with tension and the smell of rust and damp earth. Heavy fog rolled off the nearby river, obscuring the rusted train cars and creating a claustrophobic, eerie atmosphere. Sincere stood in the center of a clearing, illuminated only by the harsh, sweeping headlights of 4 black SUVs. He was flanked by Enzo, Matteo, and a dozen of his most elite enforcers, all armed with automatic weapons. Sincere wore a long, tailored black overcoat, looking every inch the ruthless kingpin the city feared. Back at the Grand Hotel, Clarabelle was locked in the penthouse vault room, a reinforced steel bunker disguised as a walk-in closet, guarded by 6 men. Sincere trusted with his life. He had refused to let her anywhere near the meeting, kissing her forehead with surprising tenderness before locking her away. "I will return for you," he had promised. And she had believed him. The crunch of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of the enemy. 3 sleek, armored Mercedes sedans pulled into the clearing, stopping directly opposite Sincere's convoy. The doors opened, and out stepped Dominic Russo. Dominic was older than Sincere, a silver-haired fox with a vicious, unpredictable streak. He was accompanied by a small army of his own men, their weapons drawn and leveled at the Vaughn crew. The standoff was a powder keg, waiting for a single spark. "Sincere?" Dominic called out, his voice echoing in the damp air. He smiled, but it didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "It's been a while since we shared the same air. I hear you've developed a soft spot for heavy women and stray civilians." Sincere didn't flinch at the insult. His face was a mask of carved granite. "Where is the boy, Dominic? I don't have time for your theatrics." Dominic snapped his fingers. Two massive Russo enforcers dragged a bruised, sobbing figure from the back of the center sedan and threw him onto the gravel. It was Derek. His tailored suit was torn, his face was swollen, and he was trembling uncontrollably. "Please," Derek whimpered, looking up at Sincere with wide, terrified eyes. "Vaughn, please, tell them you'll pay my debt. I didn't mean any of it." Sincere looked down at the man who had tormented Clarabel, who had planned to murder her for a payout, and felt absolutely nothing but disgust. "You are a worm, Derek. You aren't worth the dirt you are bleeding on." "He might be a worm," Dominic laughed, stepping forward. "But he is a very useful worm. He told me quite a story, Sincere. He told me that your trusted accountant, Arthur Pendleton, has a terrible gambling habit of his own, a habit that Derek discovered and used to blackmail Arthur into handing over the shipping manifests and security rotations for Navy Pier." Sincere's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Arthur Pendleton, the man had been with his father's crew for 20 years. If Arthur had flipped, the Vaughn Syndicate's entire infrastructure was compromised. "Derek promised me the pier," Dominic continued, his tone turning menacing. "In exchange, I was going to erase his $250,000 debt and provide the cleanup crew to make his little girlfriend's accident look authentic for the insurance company." "And now?" Sincere asked smoothly, betraying none of the internal rage boiling in his veins. "Now," Dominic sneered, "you've complicated things by taking the fat girl under your wing. So here is the deal, Sincere. You sign over the Navy Pier routes to the Russo family tonight. If you do, I hand over Derek, and I give you Arthur Pendleton's head in a box. If you refuse—" Dominic trailed off, gesturing to his heavily armed men. "We go to war. And I promise you, I will send my best assassins to the Grand Hotel. No vault can keep her safe forever." Derek sobbed on the ground, a pathetic, broken mess. "Just give them the routes, Vaughn. She's just a librarian. She's nothing." In a flash of movement so fast it blurred, Sincere drew the sleek, suppressed tactical pistol from his shoulder holster. He didn't aim at Dominic. He aimed straight down. Thwip! A muffled gunshot echoed softly in the fog. Derek screamed, clutching his right kneecap as dark red blossomed across his torn trousers. He collapsed, writhing in agony on the wet gravel. "That," Sincere said calmly, lowering the smoking weapon, "is for speaking her name." The Russo men raised their rifles, but Sincere's men instantly mirrored the action. The tension was suffocating. "Are you insane?" Dominic roared, stepping back. "You shoot a man at a parley." "He is not a man," Sincere corrected coldly. "He is an animal who tried to hurt what is mine." "Now, Dominic, you have miscalculated entirely." Sincere reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the gravel next to the bleeding Derek. "I don't need you to give me Arthur Pendleton," Sincere said, a cruel, victorious smile finally playing on his lips. "Enzo found Arthur 2 hours ago, attempting to board a private flight to the Caymans. Arthur has already confessed everything. He is currently hanging by his ankles in one of my meatpacking plants. The Navy Pier security rotations have already been changed. The codes are void." Dominic's smug expression vanished, replaced by a dark, furious realization. He had lost his leverage. "You brought me a useless hostage and a dead deal, Dominic," Sincere taunted gently. "So here is my counteroffer. You take your men and you leave my territory tonight. You never mention my name, or Clarabelle's name ever again. If I ever see a Russo operative within 10 blocks of the Grand Hotel, I won't just take your shipping routes. I will take your life, your family's lives, and burn your legacy to ash." Dominic glared at Sincere, his chest heaving. He looked at the folder on the ground, then at the bleeding, useless accountant whining on the gravel. He knew when he was beaten. "Leave the rat," Dominic spat to his men, turning on his heel. "He's Vaughan's problem now." The Russo men piled back into their Mercedes sedans, the vehicles kicking up gravel as they sped away into the fog, retreating into the shadows of the city. Sincere stood over Derek, who was sobbing and clutching his shattered knee. Enzo stepped forward, his face impassive. "What do you want us to do with him, boss?" Enzo asked. "The police?" "The police are too kind for a man who plots to murder innocent women," Sincere said softly. He looked down at Derek, his eyes devoid of mercy. "Take him to the harbor. Concrete boots. Let him pay his debts at the bottom of Lake Michigan." "No, please!" Derek screamed, as Matteo and another enforcer hauled him up by his armpits, dragging him toward the back of an SUV. "Clarabelle wouldn't want this. She's too nice. She'll hate you for this." Sincere turned his back, ignoring the desperate pleas fading into the fog. He looked up at the hazy Chicago skyline. Derek was wrong. Clarabelle didn't need to know the violent mechanics of his world, but she would never have to fear the monsters in it ever again, because she belonged to the biggest monster of them all, and he was finally going home to her. Midnight crept over the Chicago skyline, casting long, fractured reflections of neon across the dark waters of Lake Michigan. Inside the reinforced steel walls of the penthouse vault, Clarabelle sat on a plush velvet ottoman, her knees pulled to her chest. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm raging in her mind. Genevieve's beautiful navy dress felt heavy against her skin now. Every passing minute stretched into an eternity. She kept imagining the worst. Gunfire in the fog, Sincere bleeding out on the cold ground, Dominic Russo's men breaking down the penthouse doors to finish what Derek had started. Then, the heavy metallic thud of the vault's locking mechanism echoed through the small space. Clarabelle scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The thick steel door swung outward, revealing the dimly lit master bedroom. Standing in the threshold was Sincere. He looked exhausted. His black overcoat was damp with the night's heavy fog, and a stray lock of raven hair fell across his forehead, partially obscuring the silver scar through his eyebrow. But he was whole. He was alive. "Sincere," she gasped, closing the distance between them before her rational mind could stop her. She practically threw herself into his massive chest, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. Sincere let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he left the South Side rail yards. His strong arms enveloped her instantly, pulling her lush, curved body flush against his. He buried his face in the soft crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of vanilla and jasmine that belonged entirely to her. For a man who lived a life bathed in adrenaline and calculated cruelty, the warmth of this woman was an intoxicating drug. "I told you I would return," he murmured against her skin, his gravelly voice vibrating through her. "You are safe, Mea Luz. It is done." Clarabelle pulled back just enough to look up into his stormy, dark eyes. "What happened? Where is Derek?" Sincere reached up, his rough, calloused fingers gently smoothing a stray curl behind her ear. He didn't want to bring the grime of the harbor into this pristine sanctuary, but he refused to lie to her. Derek will never walk the streets of this city again. He is no longer your concern. The Russos have retreated. The threat is entirely neutralized. He's dead, she whispered, her voice trembling, not with sorrow for the man who had tormented her, but with the sheer gravity of the violence surrounding her. He is paying his debts in a place where he cannot hurt anyone, Sincere answered carefully, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. Do not waste another tear on a coward who sought to extinguish your light. He is the past. We are the present. He stepped back, shrugging off his damp overcoat and tossing it onto a leather armchair. As he moved, Claribel noticed the tension radiating from his broad shoulders. He was a king who had just secured his kingdom, but the crown was incredibly heavy. "You're freezing," she said softly, her nurturing instincts overriding her residual fear. She reached out, her soft, plump hands resting against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat through the crisp fabric of his dress shirt. "Come sit down. Let me get you something." Sincere looked down at her hands, a profound sense of awe washing over him. In his world, hands only reached out to take, to harm, or to beg. Claribel's hands offered comfort. She was completely unguarded, her generous curves pressed against him without an ounce of the shame Derek had meticulously instilled in her. "I don't need anything but you," Sincere said, his voice dropping an octave, raw with a sudden, overwhelming hunger. He moved his hands to her waist, his thumbs tracing the flare of her wide hips through the silk dress. "Do you understand what you've done to me, Claribel? In 24 hours you have completely dismantled my sanity." Claribel's breath hitched. "I didn't mean to." "I am glad you did," he growled softly. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was entirely devoid of the polite restraint he had shown the night before. It was a kiss of absolute possession, searing and demanding. Claribel melted into him, a soft moan escaping her throat. Derek's kisses had always felt like obligations, rushed and devoid of passion. Sincere kissed her like he was dying of thirst and she was the only oasis in the desert. His large hands slid up her back, tangling in her dark hair, anchoring her to him. She felt the hard, sculpted muscle of his body pressing against her softness, a perfect, contrasting puzzle. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing heavily. Sincere rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me," he commanded softly, leaving no room for argument. "Move your life here. Let me give you the world." "I don't need the world," Claribel whispered, tracing the line of his strong jaw. "I just need to know this is real." "I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you," he vowed. Over the next 3 months, the penthouse at the Grand Hotel ceased to be a gilded cage and became a true home. Claribel's life transformed dramatically. She resigned from her tedious job at the city library, instead taking over the curation of Sincere's massive, private collection of rare first-edition books housed in his secondary estate in the Gold Coast district. Genevieve became a frequent visitor, working with Claribel to build a wardrobe that celebrated her body. Claribel began to wear bold colors, tailored suits, and clinging silks. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had defined her existence with Derek evaporated. She was eating well, laughing freely, and discovering a deep, buried well of confidence. Sincere was a revelation. To the underworld of Chicago, he remained the ruthless, untouchable don of the Vaughn Syndicate. But behind closed doors, he worshipped Claribel. He treated her body like a religious artifact, mapping every curve, every soft stretch mark, and every inch of thick thigh with a reverent devotion that shattered her lingering insecurities. He took her to private showings at the Art Institute, chartered yachts on Lake Michigan under the stars, and ensured she never wanted for anything. However, peace in their world was always a fragile illusion. Autumn painted Chicago in shades of amber and rust. Inside an exclusive, invite-only club high above the magnificent Mile, Clarabelle sat in the luxurious dining room. She wore a stunning, deep red velvet gown that draped beautifully over her wide hips, with diamonds glittering at her throat, a recent gift from Sincere. She was waiting for him to finish a brief meeting downstairs. As she sipped her sparkling water, the heavy mahogany doors parted. A thin, sharply dressed woman stormed in. It was Valentina Rossi, the daughter of a prominent businessman with ties to the Vaughan family. Rumor had it, Valentina once believed she was destined to marry Sincere to unite their fortunes. Valentina's eyes locked onto Clarabelle with vindictive light. She marched over, her stilettos clicking sharply. "So," Valentina sneered, looking Clarabelle up and down with undisguised disgust. "You're the stray dog Sincere picked up. The rumors didn't do justice to the sheer volume of you." A year ago, Clarabelle would have withered, apologized, and fled in tears. But a year ago, she wasn't Sincere Vaughan's woman. Clarabelle slowly set down her crystal glass. She didn't break eye contact, letting a cool, unimpressed silence stretch between them, a negotiation tactic she had learned from Sincere. "Can I help you, Ms. Rossi?" Clarabelle asked, her voice steady. Valentina bristled. "I'm observing a train wreck. Sincere is a king. He needs a queen who can stand beside him, not a bloated librarian." "That is enough." The voice cracked through the room like a whip. Valentina froze. Sincere strode in, flanked by Enzo and Matteo. He didn't look at Valentina. His dark, furious eyes were fixed on Clarabelle. Seeing her perfectly composed, a flicker of immense pride replaced his rage. He stepped to the table, his large hand resting protectively on Clarabelle's bare shoulder, his thumb stroking her skin. Only then did he turn to Valentina. "Sincere," Valentina stammered. "I was just introducing myself to your guest." "She is not my guest," Sincere rumbled, his voice carrying to every eavesdropping table. "She is my partner, and you are breathing her air without permission. Sincere, please, my father." "Your father will receive a call in 5 minutes, informing him that your crude tongue just cost his firm the Southside development contracts," Sincere interrupted coldly. "You have 10 seconds to leave. If you ever speak to my woman again, your family will be exiled before sunrise." Valentina gasped, tears of humiliation springing to her eyes. Realizing every powerful figure in Chicago was watching, she turned and fled. Sincere exhaled, the dangerous tension bleeding away. He looked down at Clarabelle, his expression softening. "Did she upset you, Mea Luce?" Clarabelle covered his hand with hers, smiling radiantly. "Not even a little bit. She's a very unhappy woman. I'm just hungry." Sincere let out a rare, genuine laugh. He leaned down and kissed her, ignoring the stares of the elite. "Then we shall eat." Later that night, in the sprawling sanctuary of their penthouse, the city lights twinkled far below. Clarabelle stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing only one of Sincere's oversized dress shirts. Sincere came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face in her neck. "You handled her flawlessly," he murmured. "You looked like a true queen." Clarabelle leaned back into his embrace, feeling entirely safe. "I had a good teacher." Sincere turned her around, his stormy eyes filled with unyielding devotion. "I didn't teach you how to be strong, Clarabelle. You survived the darkness long before I found you, I just provided the light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box, opening it to reveal a flawless emerald-cut diamond ring flanked by dark obsidian stones. "There are no coincidences in my world," Sincere said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were meant to sit at my side. Marry me, Clarabel. Let me protect you, worship you, and build an empire in your name." Tears of pure joy spilled over her lashes. She didn't hesitate or doubt her worthiness. "Yes," she breathed, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, Sincere." He slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing a pact forged in chaos and bound by an unbreakable love. The Mafia boss had found his queen, and the city would forever bow to the woman who taught the monster how to love. A whispered threat over a plate of risotto changed the trajectory of 2 lives forever. What began as an evening of cruel humiliation for a woman conditioned to hate her own reflection became the catalyst for an empire's greatest love story. Clarabel Collins learned that true power doesn't come from shrinking to fit a weak man's expectations, but from taking up space unapologetically in the arms of a man strong enough to hold her. Sincere Vaughan, a king of the underworld who traded in fear and violence, found his redemption in the soft, generous curves of a librarian who dared to see the man behind the monster. The city of Chicago remained a dangerous, unforgiving landscape of crime and betrayal. But high above the fog and the gunfire, in a fortress built on absolute devotion, the Don and his queen ruled supreme, completely untouchable.